The Let's Talk podcast was inspired by the MISD's Leadership and Empowerment Team, or LET for short. Our mission is to ensure that all students, regardless of race, culture, or gender, have an equitable learning environment so they can become the leaders they want to be. And now, here are your hosts, Daniel Norwood and Ted Madden.
Welcome to another week of the Let's Talk podcast. We've been doing these since the middle of August, and we continue to talk about empowering student leaders with our own leaders from around Mesquite ISD. We do this every week, but just to reset, we think it's important in this particular area of discussion to introduce both who we are and what we are. My name is Ted Madden. I create videos for the district's communications team, and I'm a 47-year-old white man.
And I'm Daniel Norwood, the social studies coordinator for the district, also a leader on the LET committee, and a 38-year-old black man.
And I'm Kyle Fritchie. I'm the secondary language arts and languages other than English coordinator, and I'm a 37-year-old white woman.
So as Daniel put in the notes, he's got your title as curriculum coordinator, secondary English language arts. Translate, please.
Sure. So English language arts used to kind of be reading and writing, that idea, but we've kind of combined it. It's anything where students are reading a text, responding to a text, and then writing their own text. And the state of Texas now says a text is anything that can be seen, heard, or viewed. So anything that we do in ELA where students are responding to some sort of ideas.
And LOTE.
And LOTE.
Yeah.
So all the Spanish, German, French, and ASL teachers.
What was that word you said? LOTE?
LOTE.
Languages other than English.
There's so many acronyms. I've been here 4 years and I still get barraged with acronyms that I don't understand.
When I first got the job as the secondary coordinator for ELA, right? Not the elementary, but secondary. I sent my brother my business card and he's like, oh, you're secondary? You're not even like number one? And I was like, no. So he's not in education.
Yep, that's right. Now, Kyle, I know, we've had a lot this summer that we've had to do just to adjust to what a global pandemic, but, more locally, we know that affects what our kids do, what our teachers do, how we operate school. How have you noticed what changes have you noticed due to COVID in the way that our teachers deliver instruction?
Sure. I think, in all the work that I've been doing with teachers this year, I try to be very transparent in that I might have taught for a long time and then worked in the curriculum world, but I've certainly never taught during a pandemic. So I try to be very open with what they need. And in ELA, or language arts, we have all new state standards this year. So all new textbooks, all new curriculum. So on top of COVID, our teachers, our high school teachers specifically, are dealing with all new expectations, new curriculum. And our middle school teachers and our elementary teachers just got new curriculum last year. So in some ways it creates some opportunities where as we're building as we go, we're building that plane while we're flying it. But I also think there's some things that we've really been stressing in language arts specifically, but also in LOTE, is giving students the opportunity to own their learning. And a lot of that is talking to their neighbors and presenting. And one of my favorite quotes that I think about a lot in creating curriculum is that knowledge is not received, it has to be constructed. So students have to have the opportunity to get out there and get their hands dirty and really apply it in order for them to really own it. And in COVID, we've really had to adjust because we can't really necessarily get up and say, all right, kids, let's all go stand in four corners of the room and have a debate.
That's true.
We have a lot of the text that we do in language arts where we're asking students to sit together with one text and work as a group, and we can't really do that. So we've really had to adjust to that without losing that spirit and that idea. And the teachers have been so flexible and so creative in finding ways for students to collaborate. Maybe they're doing it through a Google Doc and they're having a conversation with someone that's literally just on the other side of the room from them. But teachers have been so creative and so flexible in finding ways to not lose that. We don't want to go back to where it's just so the teacher's delivering a lecture and the students are just sitting there, or the teacher's reading the novel or the text and the students are just sitting there. So it's definitely complicated to figure out a way to kind of keep that.
You're part of the LET committee. You were there for the first couple of meetings. What were some of the highlights from those first two meetings from your perspective?
Sure. I think One of the highlights, or I'll say two main things. One is Daniel and I have a whole lot of conversations just as being friends and being
He talks
coworkers.
to everybody, doesn't he?
He does, he does. And so it was very, I feel like, impactful to sit in a room with other leaders and see that we're all kind of dealing and grappling with this. No one has the answers, but we're all open and looking for those answers. And I think the most poignant parts for me were listening to the students, because I think a lot of times we get ideas as adults of how things are going to land or how things are going to be received. And, you know, teenagers specifically have a really good way of just cutting right through and saying, well, actually, you know, and I think it's great for us to hear what their actual experience is. I think a lot about someone's perception is their reality. So even if that wasn't what we intended, if that's how they're experiencing it, that's their reality that we have to respond to. And so listening to the stories of the students and their opinions and what they've gone through, I think was what I walked away with the most, thinking, kind of trying to mull over and think about a lot.
Yeah, you've been in there, I guess, since our very first one, and we've all, I think, learned a lot. What are some of the positive changes you've seen as a result of the committee work and the discussions that we had with students?
Sure. I think that we're having conversations that I don't think we would have had. I think we're trying to have productive conversations. And like I said, we don't have all the answers, but just the fact that we're willing to have the conversation and grapple with it and try to work through it, I think is very positive. And, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. We're not going to dismantle and build back up all the things that we feel like we need to work on. And I think things come up all the time, whether it's what's going on in the world or in our country or just locally, that we realize, like, oh, that's something we need to talk about. That's something, you know, I know your to-do list, Daniel, grows and grows.
It's huge.
with issues and things that come up.
Yeah.
And I see it a lot as my husband is a marathon runner. And so I think this whole experience, it's running a marathon. We're not going to just create a committee and flip a switch and be like, all right, we're good, let's, you know, move on. So I think the conversations have been really important, and not shying away from the difficult conversations. You know, really thinking about where, as a white woman, what do I need to do to kind of grow and learn and change? And what do we need to do to support our students and our teachers? You know, it's this big community that we've all kind of got to work together. And I think I've been very impressed that we haven't wanted to shy away, even though it feels more comfortable to shy away from those conversations sometimes.
That's very true.
Daniel, you and I were talking before we sat down to record this podcast about discussing difficult subjects with students in a classroom setting and the potential minefields that there are with that.
Sure.
How do you avoid the minefields? How do you avoid getting hit by a landmine while also having constructive conversations about touchy subjects?
Can I start on that
Sure.
one? And I just want to say, like, again, this is something me and Kyle talk about too, because it is, as a teacher, I think a lot of it depends on your comfort level with said topic. You know, whether it's race or politics or, you know, history for us. And I've often said in social studies, there's almost no way to avoid what today we would consider controversial. But again, I think it goes back to what are the resources, what are your objectives, and then making sure that, like, if we're talking about a topic, the kids have the loudest voice in the room. So for me, in social studies, it was more about how do I present factual information to my students to make sure that, hey, when they read or when they analyze the situation in the way a historian would, they begin to apply their own thinking to it, as opposed to saying, well, Mr. Norwood believes this way, and yeah, that's how I believe. It's really more about, hey, here's what happened in history. What do we think about that? How do you think that had implications on the way we see the world today? And, when students begin to see it that way, it leaves space for them to learn, to grow, and then it becomes their own. And that's, in social studies, that's how I handled it as a teacher. And right now we're kind of in that process of training to make sure more of our guys understand that way. Because that, it's not always the easiest, but it's the route we have to go if we're going to really approach and help our kids grow in those areas.
I think we have a lot of those same conversations in language arts because we are looking at, we're reading To Kill a Mockingbird. How do you avoid having conversations about race and justice and the Jim Crow South without, you can't read that book without talking about those things. But even when we read something like Shakespeare, we'll have conversations about gender roles and gender norms and what we expect of, our families and relationships. And so one of the things I think is most important is just asking those open-ended questions. And I think we're allowed to do that a lot more in language arts and in social studies than maybe some of the other content areas.
That's true.
But in our curriculum, for example, it's all based around an essential question. So they'll spend the entire 6 weeks, students will, with when is it important to take a stand? And the students explore that question. And it's not about necessarily taking a stand about race or gender, it's whatever they think is important. And so we've had students that get really passionate about environmental issues. We've had students that get really passionate about why is my library closed on the weekends when I need to go to the library? Like little very specific things to their world, but the teacher isn't the one driving that conversation. They set the stage and then they let the students in a safe space. And I think the relationships are really important. You don't want to come in on the first day of school and have a really difficult conversation. I used to teach my students on the first day how we would have conversations where if you agree, I'll go on this side and you disagree, go on this side. But the conversations I asked on the first day as an icebreaker were like, if you think McDonald's is best, go over here, and if you think Taco Bell is best, going over here. But I set up from the first day that we're going to debate and have those conversations in class, but we got to build up to the relationships of talking about, I used to teach the I Have a Dream speech. I used to teach the Diary of Anne Frank, and so we'd have to have those conversations, and sometimes students simplify and say, well, why didn't they just fight the Nazis? And so we have to kind of provide that context, but without, making it so black or white or it's this way or this way. It's, allowing students to kind of explore and figure out what they believe and what they think. And sometimes our teachers feel confident in doing that. I'm a very opinionated person, so I always felt very comfortable kind of letting students talk and share their opinions. And sometimes our teachers don't feel that way, and so we have to, like Daniel was saying, kind of help them see that it's not about their opinion, it's about letting the students kind of build and grow and figure out what they think.
How long were you in the classroom?
I was in the classroom for 9 years.
You bring up one of the things that I think is so essential even to teaching with anything is practice. And I know from teaching in the classroom and then being in social studies and curriculum that, those opening weeks of practice are they're crucial on how to have a conversation with someone you disagree with. I know in social studies we have some resources, and I say it online just because, or I say it on here, just because I know there are folks who, like if you're looking for a resource, I know Stanford Civic Online Reasoning is a really good one for helping our kids begin to, learn how to disagree, learn how to basically see online content and know what they're looking at, begin to see, hey, what is the, what's the word? Media, kind of the bias sometimes that exists in media.
Having that media literacy.
Yes, media literacy. That's what I'm looking for. And then we have a site that also came up this year that I hadn't seen before called All Sides Matter, where they actually, they'll take a news event and write it from a right-wing point of view, a left-wing point of view, and a center point of view. And it's a place where kids can look at today's stories and actually begin to kind of analyze and see like, okay, this is the way it might be phrased if it's one way or another. But I was wondering just with ELA, what other resources are available? I know you talked about new resources for teachers who might be looking to dive in.
Sure. So one of the things that we've been using a lot this year, of course, our textbooks have been updated and are a lot more diverse than they used to be, both in experience and culture, but we still have some units and pieces there that it's just, very kind of the canon, the classics, where we don't always get the new experiences and looking at different cultures and different experiences. So we've been leaning a lot on Newsela, which is a website that we have a district account with, and that is, they basically take news articles and they put them in a format that are digestible to students. You can adjust the reading level, so you can have a third grader read the same content as a sixth grader, they might adjust the vocabulary or change some of that. But we've really leaned on that a lot. They have a whole section in there called A Mile in My Shoes. And so you can go read articles about what is it like to be a student with disabilities? What is it like to be a student that lives in rural America? What is it like to be a student that lives in the city? And, what is it like to be an African American student or a Hispanic student? And so we've been using those a lot to let the students go in and choose an experience that they want to learn about. We've also, on Newsela, they have these pro-con articles, which I just wrote a lesson last week using one of them, where they take topics that have a side, and they have a pro side and a con side. And so the students in language arts, we're not necessarily saying this is right or wrong, but how did the author build their argument? Were they persuasive or were they not? So we just used one last week about self-driving cars, pro, con. But we've done them in the past with other issues. We had one about Colin Kaepernick, about should we kneel, should we not kneel? And so allowing students to, not saying one side is right or one side is wrong, but just exploring different sides, I think has been a huge resource and a benefit. So our teachers have access to that. Our social studies teachers have access to that.
They do. We've written some in too.
Our languages other than English teachers have access to that. So that's been a really valuable resource, but it's also very current. Because it's not going to take long for our textbooks to kind of go, our last textbook adoption was a decade ago. So, we're looking at 8 years from now, maybe the state will give us a new textbook. So things are going to change a little bit since then. And so having a resource like that that's updated all the time, they add new articles every day. I think it allows us to kind of keep in tune with what's going on in the world, but also offer many different viewpoints.
Yeah, and self-driving cars still terrify me regardless.
You may terrify people when you're driving, though.
I might. I might.
So how have you personally developed or changed your opinions and outlooks since being a part of this LET committee?
So I think that I've always been very social issues minded. Like I said earlier, I'm very opinionated. And I had the benefit of growing up going to school in Garland. And so I had a very, I went to school with all different types of people. And so to me, that's just how things were. And so I kind of have been passionate about a lot of those issues my whole life. And I think a lot of that is coming from growing up in the church and really thinking about what's right and what's fair and what's just. But the experiences of the last year, I think, kind of bringing it to the forefront. Sometimes I would get passionate about something that happened to someone being harmed or some issue, some sort of injustice. And I kind of sometimes felt like I was shouting into the wind. Sometimes Facebook feels that way a little bit. But with this experience being on LET, I really do feel like there's some common ground, even though we don't always agree on everything. But there's also a path forward. Because we're not just getting together to admire the problem, we're actually looking for solutions and finding ways. Some things may be more successful than others, but I really think that has given me even more of a drive to examine all aspects of my life personally, and just thinking about those little subtle things that I never really thought about. I've shared with Daniel before that some of the things, so I'm a big GIF or GIF.
Oh,
I
yeah.
say GIF, some people say GIF.
I go with GIF, but I
It's a
still don't know.
controversy. I know, it's a
either.
controversy. I said it the other day and someone
Did you
said,
do that
what?
with your classroom, one side or the other?
Yeah, exactly. We
GIF.
should
What
have.
does the G sound?
We should have. But I was noticing that I was using a lot of GIFs as jokes that centered around Black women. And it was sort of a stereotype or a certain, that we're using them as a joke as opposed to, this awesome Beyonce GIF. I think we're all using that because Beyonce's awesome. But so I talked to Daniel about it, and I was like, am I being too critical or too but I really did. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't using that platform, even though that seems silly, as a way to marginalize a group of people. And I've really been thinking a lot about that, and not in a way where I'm going to have to, completely get rid of using GIFs. I still use them, but I'm a lot more cognizant about, am I using this culture or am I using these people and this figure as a way to be funny, or am I really, using them because I think they're cool and they're expressing something that I want to express. And I think sometimes on social media, we get caught in the newest trend, and sometimes we don't really examine where those trends come from. And so that's been really on my mind a lot. I've also been reading a lot more. I did the book study with Daniel, So You Want to Talk About Race. I've also been reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. I have a little nephew that loves books, and I've really thought a lot about the books that I'm buying him. I want to buy him books that have all different characters and all different people in them. And he loves trucks, but that doesn't mean that only books I buy him have a main character that's a truck. So I've been very cognizant about things like that. And I feel like it's very empowering because I'm thinking about who I want to be. And as a 37-year-old, I still get to change and grow and learn. And I think that's exciting. But I also think of my nephew, for example, and the world he's going to grow up in. And so it's been very powerful to kind of have these conversations constantly. Like I said, Daniel and I talk a lot, and so it's always at the forefront.
One of the things you just mentioned was the idea of how you use GIFs, and it's kind of an everyday thing. When it comes to books like So You Want to Talk About Race or Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, you see perceptions change, which then in turn could change behavior. Could you talk about maybe how book studies could not only help people gain new perceptions, but also take further actions?
Sure. So I think that I really don't think you can read a book like either of the ones you just mentioned and just put it back on the shelf and say, okay, that was an interesting read, and go on about your day. Mm-hmm. Because they cover so many things that then show up every day. And I don't think I ever would have thought about the GIFs that I use if I hadn't been reading those books and think about the way people are represented in society or the stereotypes that sometimes we fall into. And I think that one of the things I've been excited about is purposely centering our curriculum, for example, around multiple perspectives. Because when I read those books, I think, oh, wow, I never thought about that before. And so if we can give students the opportunity to think about things from multiple perspectives, in language arts, we use the metaphor of the mirrors and the windows, and the idea that when you read a book where the main character looks like you or represents your culture, then that's a mirror, and that's how you help build your identity. And if you read a book that doesn't represent you and your identity, it's a window. So you get to go experience a different culture or a different situation. And I think that when we only read things that are mirrors, and a lot of times when you are white, a lot of what you read are mirrors. I mentioned the truck book earlier. Statistically, you're more likely to find a children's book where the main character is a truck than you are to find a children's book where the main character is a Hispanic girl, just statistically. And so if you're looking for windows and mirrors, if we're not ever giving students the opportunity to read something that represents them or their culture, then it doesn't help them build their identity. And then on the flip side, if we're not giving white students the opportunity to read about a different culture, then we're not really helping them grow their perspectives either. And so I've thought a lot about the text that we use in language arts and what we're focusing on really does have such deep reverberations that we don't even see. That's what I love about being a teacher is that I've taught thousands of students over my career, and I have no idea what they're all doing. And I hope that I had a positive impact, but it's like we just kind of send them off into the world. And one of the things I think is so important is that if we're not giving the opportunity to see multiple perspectives, then they go out into the world not seeing those multiple perspectives. And so we've really tried to think a lot about that with our curriculum and what we're reading. And so when we're thinking about these book clubs that staff and teachers are doing, I really don't think that you can just have it in there. Right. And as a reading teacher, then I wonder, did you really take in what you read if that doesn't change your perspective? And so I think there's a lot of next steps that I think have to start, though, with you personally, thinking about what am I doing in my daily life that seems like I'm on autopilot, that I don't never even think about, that maybe I need to re-examine. and hopefully then you can take it beyond that. But I really do think you have to start personally.
That's good. I love what you say about the actions, because it's like you can go to a book study, put the book back on the shelf, but if you continue to do the same things daily, you haven't really made much of a difference.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
I know with the Let work, we're always constantly thinking like, all right, we're kind of step one, year one, but what are the continuations? And thankfully we're seeing a lot of principals kind of get involved, which I think in turn helps to see more actions, because they in a lot of times are the action people on their campus to make things happen. But yeah, that's good. That's really good. One more question, and me and Kyle, we talk a lot of history, and I think I know your favorite historical figure, at least one of the top 5, which is John Lewis. Can you tell us what you love about John Lewis?
So sure, I think I've always had a fascination with the civil rights movement, and I'm not totally sure why. I think I read a book about Ruby Bridges, and that anniversary was just this past week of her integrating her elementary school. But I read a book about Ruby Bridges when I was in elementary, and I remember asking my mom, like, what's this about? Like, because I didn't have the context. I didn't understand why it was a big deal that she went to school.
Yeah.
And since then, I've just been fascinated by it. And I took a course in college called The Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement. And it was taught by a professor who also was a preacher. And so he gave us all kinds of background into Dr. King. And through learning more about Dr. King, I learned about John Lewis. And one of the things that was striking to me was like, well, he's still alive. And for whatever reason in my head, maybe it's because all the pictures are always black and white. In my head, I didn't think, well, those people are still alive. And so I then just became very fascinated with John Lewis. And then I learned he was in Congress. And his story and the way he's able to deliver his message, where he talks about getting in good trouble, is just so interesting to me. And thinking about, he's been arrested hundreds of times, but it was all for good trouble. And I had the huge honor to see him speak a couple of years ago. And he talked about, we may have all come to this country in different boats, but we're all in the same ship now. And we got to work together and figure out a way to make it work. And he is just so inspiring to me. And I love that even as he got older, he was arrested I think 2 years ago on the floor of the Capitol.
Wow.
Because he was protesting.
Yeah.
And so, that idea that protesting isn't a movement or isn't just like an event, but it's like a lifestyle, it's a movement. He totally lived that. And it just clicked for me, I think, because I was like, whoa, he's still alive. He's the last living speaker at the March on Washington.
Yeah.
So when he passed away, that was the last one. He was and just to learn the history about his speech. He was going in very ardent and strident, and Dr. King had to talk him down and say, okay, that's not how we bring people together. We got to find ways to look for compromise. And he's an amazing figure.
We appreciate you coming in.
Absolutely.
I thought it was a great
Thank you.
discussion. That's Kyle Fritchie, Curriculum Coordinator, Secondary English Language Arts for Mesquite ISD. Next week, we'll visit with Kim Edwards, who is our Director of Counseling Services. For Daniel Norwood, I'm Ted Madden. Let's talk again next week.